To fully appreciate the new cartridges, such as the 6.5 Creedmoor, you really have to go back in history and understand that famous of all famous cartridges, the 757 Mauser. Now, the 757 Mauser may be old news to some of you and new news to some of you younger folks who probably have never heard of it, because this cartridge has sort of fallen out of favor, but it is an important historical cartridge because it did many things, including set the table for brand new cartridges such as the 6.5 Creedmoor. And that's what we're going to cover in this episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors. Now, to get started, let's go way back in time to 1892. That is when Peter Paul Mauser from Germany invented the 7x57 Mauser. He got his inspiration from the German military's cartridge known as now the 8x57 Mauser. But the 8x57 Mauser was not created by Peter Paul Mauser. It was used in Mauser's rifles in World War I and II by the Germans, but the German military actually designed that cartridge. And that was important because this was the first cartridge that did not have a rim, like the old 3030 had a rim. A rimmed cartridge, you saw that back in those days on almost everything until this 8x57 Mauser came along. They got rid of the rim and figured out how to make a groove in there that they could use to extract that cartridge. And that changed a lot. So the 8x57 was a little bit longer, a little bit bigger than the 7x57, but the head size on it, those were the same. And that's what carries across all the way to the 6.5 Creedmoor. We're going to find out all about that. And then we're going to see how well the 757 Mauser does against some modern competition for velocities and energies and such. So 1892, Mauser is designing this cartridge instead of the 8x57. Why would he do that? I think it was probably because the military in those days kept that as kind of a state secret, and I don't think average folks, civilians, could use rifles and or cartridges that the military was using. I may be wrong on that. If anyone knows better, let us know. But I think that's what was going on. So he just took the case, shortened it a little bit, or at least shoved the shoulder back a little bit, and then necked it down to 7mm. And that was pretty much, as far as I can tell from my research, the first 7mm cartridge in the world. You've got to give it a lot of credit for setting the table because, man, do we have a lot of 7mm these days. So the table has been set with a fairly straight-walled cartridge. Got your bottleneck, got your narrow caliber, highly efficient. It's got rid of the rim, and you have set the table for pretty much dozens and dozens of cartridges we know today, such as the 30-06. Now, how does the 757 fit in with the 30-06? The Spanish Army bought a whole bunch of Mauser's rifles, the 1893 models, chambered for that 7x57. And then we went to war with Spain in 1898, Cuba, Manila Bay. They blew up one of our warships, or at least we claim they did. And we went to war there and in the Philippines. And there was the famous battles of San Juan Hill, you may have heard of, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. They were there fighting with 4570s, the new 30-40 Krag bolt-action rifle from Norway that we had bought as our military rifle. Didn't match up to that 757 that the Spaniards were using. So we had a heck of a time. They could shoot fast and far and reach a lot farther and more accurately than we could with our firearms. So after that, Roosevelt and the military brass got to work and came up with the 30-06. Where do you suppose it came from? Yeah, right there. Same diameter head, 0.473 inch on both of them, and the same rim size, 0.473, I should have said. The rim size is 0.473 on both, and then the head, right there at the webbing, ahead of the extraction groove, it should be about 470, sometimes 469, but I will tell you this, when you actually measure these things, they don't come out to what the book says they should be. Those are nominal dimensions, and they can be a little bit less. And these are both coming in at 0.466 on the 57 and the 30-06. But if you measure your 270, for instance, which of course was the 30-06 neck down, you'll find the same dimensions because that's the parent case. So I guess what I'm driving at is that Well, ultimately, that 8x57 is a parent of all of these, plus the next generation down. When you shorten the 30-06 to get to 308, you've got the same head size, the same rim, everything else. So there's a big, long family that strides through. Then you've got the 243 Winchester, same thing, 7mm 08, the 260, 358. Just all of these cartridges have the same head size, the same rim size roughly, and they all spring from that 8x57 and or the 757. So in the US, we were never too enamored of the 8x57 because it was used against us in 2 world wars. It was the 30-06 against the 8x57. The 7x57 after that Spanish-American War wasn't any kind of a problem for us. So a lot of folks would use that one, but it was never super popular in this country. And it was in Africa and India, wherever the Brits went. Because what the British did was they took the 757, Rigby got a hold of it, and they renamed it 275 Rigby. You may have heard of that. The 275 Rigby is exactly dimensionally the same as the 757 Mauser, but it was a Rigby English or British product, and they didn't want to, I guess, use the German name for it, so they just changed the name. But it's funny because those wonderful Rigby Mauser rifles were built on Mauser actions, and I think for a while, or maybe all the time, Mauser supplied the barrels as well. But Rigby obviously changed things up, stocked them, and changed the name to the 275, and that became a really important and famous cartridge because of hunters such as William Dalrymple Maitland Bell, a Scotsman who went over to Africa when he was about 19 years old, and he became a commercial ivory hunter. And what adventures that man had. But he discovered shortly in that he didn't need the horsepower of the really big elephant guns. He could get the job done with a 757 shooting a full patch, metal jacketed military bullet. So it was a solid 173 grains, moving around 2,300 feet per second, and he could drop elephants with a single shot because he knew how to reach the brain. He knew from any angle where to get that brain shot for an instant kill. And he says that, keeping careful records, he came up with 1.5 bullets for every elephant harvested. So he really set the table for the 757 and put it on the map. Another famous hunter who used the 757 a bit was Jim Corbett in India for the man-eating leopards and tigers over there. He used a 450-400, mostly a double gun, but he would use the 757, and he took some big tigers with it. And man-eating leopards, they had a lot of those over there. And some of those, gosh, he took one that had killed something like 425 people, a tiger. And a leopard he took had been counted for something like 146 people. It was a big problem, and he was quite the hero for taking care of them. So he had the 275 as well. Over here in the States, it wasn't all that popular. A fair number of hunters used it, but we would just pretty much go with that 30-06 because that's the American cartridge, right? And Roosevelt took that to Africa, Stuart Edward White, Roosevelt, lots of different people used the 30-06 instead of the 757. I think most famously here, it was Jack O'Connor's wife, Eleanor, who grabbed that 757, and that was her favorite rifle, favorite cartridge, and she took all sorts of game with that. But in general, we did not gravitate toward the 757 unless we had a lot of historical interest in folks like this, or we're going to Africa. But how does this cartridge now stack up? Sure, it enabled us to develop all the other cartridges, but how does it stack up these days? Should you consider getting one? What is its benefit? I found out that it is a pretty close matchup to the 270 Winchester. I know a lot of folks look at it and say, well, wait a minute, if Bell was shooting 2,300 feet per second, 270 goes 3,000 feet per second. That's not even close. But he was using a 173 grain bullet. The 270 uses 130, 140, 150. So what I did was ran some numbers on the ballistics of these two, and I compared a 150 grain bullet in each, and we're going to see how close the old stodgy 757 comes to the 270. Now, the 757 has been throttled back because, remember, it goes clear back to 1892 and some early design Mauser rifles that weren't as strong as the later models. So, as a result of that, they can't, at the factory, really load it up to high pressures. It's somewhere under about 48,000 copper units of pressure are the SAMI specs for it. Now, the Europeans will load it a little hotter. So if you want to get the fastest factory ammunition, you need to go with the European products. Norma, RWS, and Fiocchi, for instance. The US ones really throttle it back. Now, an interesting thing about those pressures. The 757 was neck down in this country to make the 257 Roberts. And that was a real popular deer round back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. But the pressure on that is about 4,000 to 5,000 PSI or copper units of pressure higher than the 757, which always struck me as a little bit odd. But I guess it's because of the older rifles that were chambered for that 757. And then the real screamer was the 244 Remington in 1955. That's the 6mm Remington these days. Same cartridge, just a different name. They took the 257 Roberts, necked that down to 6mm, and they pushed the pressures up to 65,000 PSI, the same as the 270 and the 22-250. That's high pressure. And that always makes me scratch my head and go, why can't we push in a modern rifle that's really strong, the 757, to those higher pressures? And I know a lot of hand loaders who do. I cannot condone this and recommend it. It's just not safe. But a lot of folks say they do it. So study your hand loading manuals. Be careful with that. Watch your pressure signs. But hand loaders report that they can get much better performance out of the 757 by hand loading than by using factory ammunition. Something you might want to consider. Now, let's get back to the 270 and see how these two compare. 150 grain bullet in each. I use the Accubon long range from Nosler because it has a high BC. It might not be accurate as reported by Nosler, but we're just going to go with their numbers as a comparison. We'll use the 150 grain Accubon long range in the 7mm Mauser as well. So the BC on the 270 version is 0.591, pretty high. It's 0.546, a little lower on the 757. Muzzle velocity is 2,858 feet per second on the 270, 2,831, so almost the same muzzle velocities out of these. The muzzle energies are pretty close, 2721 on the 270, 2670 on the 7mm. The recoil from these in an 8-pound rifle is not bad. It's 20 foot-pounds on the 270 and 18.5 out of the 7x57. So they're pretty much running neck and neck. Now, if you zero those for a 6-inch target so that you never shoot higher than 3 inches above your point of aim, and that happens at around 150 yards, you're going to get out to about 292 yards maximum distance before you drop 3 inches out of the 270. The 7x57 will go 285 yards or so, and then that'll drop below. So pretty darn comparable. At 200 yards, you look at the numbers, you're dropping you're still high 2.2 inches with the 270 and 2.1 with the 7x57, so they're practically twins. As for wind deflection, right angle wind, 10 miles an hour, 2.2 inches out of the 270, 2.4 inches out of the 757. So if you're only shooting out to 200 yards, what's the difference? The 757 is just as good as the 270. But what happens if we go farther? Let's go to 300 yards. That's been a pretty long shot for all these years. Not too many of us shoot farther than that. But you're going to get 3.8 inches of drop now out of your 270, 4.2 out of the 7x57. So you're still within a half inch. Wind deflection, 5 inches out of the 270, 5.6 out of the 7x57. Man, these guys are still running neck and neck. And I think that will surprise a lot of folks who think, well, that 270 is famous as a fast shooting, flat shooting, open country rifle. And we just don't tend to think of the 757 that way. But I think we should because it's hanging right in there. So now let's stretch it out to 500 yards. 34 inches of drop out of the 270, 37 out of the 7x57. We're still within 3 inches. And at 500 yards, 3 inches, that doesn't amount to a heck of a lot. You can easily compensate for that by knowing your trajectory curve. What about the wind deflection? There's only an inch difference, an inch advantage to the 270. So as you can see, this 757 is no dog of a cartridge. I don't know why it isn't more popular. These days, the 7mm 08 Remington is considered a pretty close match. I think I've got one right here. And you can see it's a little bit shorter. It's essentially the 757 with the wall straightened out a little bit and the shoulder pushed back. But of course, this was done from the 308. But this is allowed more pressure, and that enables it to go a little bit faster with a little bit less powder. So I think that's stolen a lot of thunder from the 757. And the other one is the 280, which of course is the 30-06 neck down to 28. And that'll beat it by a little bit, but probably not much, about 100 feet per second. So the cool thing about the 757 is it's sort of a short action cartridge, but it functions beautifully in a standard length action. You look at the sizes here, and a lot of folks will say, well, no, wait a minute. The 308 comes at a maximum cartridge length of 2.8 inches, and the 757 is set up for 3 inches max. So the short actions won't handle it. Not necessarily. A lot of short action rifles will handle the longer cartridge bullet combination, but their magazine wells might not. So you can change out the magazine well on a lot of models and it will still function just fine. Or you just don't shoot the longer bullets in it. Push that bullet in a little bit farther and your 757 is going to do just as well. So it does work well in some short action rifles. But the advantage in a standard length action like a 30-06 length action, as you can see here, it gives you more room to shoot the long bullets. So if you want to go with a really long high BC bullets these days, you can seat them out a little bit further, not shove them down into the powder space, and get full power out of that case. So there's still a lot of life left in the 57. Now, I think the really special thing about the 757 that would encourage me to select it over the 7mm 08 or any of the other medium speed 7mm these days would be the nostalgia and the tradition of it. I think maybe it's because I'm a little older, you get to that point in life when you start appreciating more than just the highest velocity or the greatest accuracy within a pinprick and all the rest of it. It's just a lot of fun to think about where that cartridge has been and what it has done and what it has contributed to the development of cartridges in the hunting industry over the 130 years or more now. So that 757 is really quite a cartridge. If you're a collector, if you like to have a good rounded collection of cartridges and or rifles and have some fun hunting with them, I would hardly recommend you look into a 757. You don't find a lot of modern rifles chambered for it anymore. It's just not popular enough. But you can find a lot of older rifles, especially the Mauser 98s. Ruger has chambered it quite a bit in its rifles, and it's just a great cartridge. I have used it in Africa, and it was everything it was built up to be. It's just a real mild shooter, quite pleasant to work with. And yeah, it just adds a little bit to the hunt when you know you're walking around with a cartridge that was used by famous hunters like Bell, who were taking buffalo and elephant and every other thing over there with that little cartridge. It can really do the job. So if you're interested in the history of cartridges as well as their performance, don't overlook the 757, aka 275 Rigby. It is a great classic round. That's my story on the 757 Mauser, folks. Hey, if you want to read about some of the exploits of these gentlemen, Wanderings of an Elephant Hunter by Bell, highly recommended. I've read that book probably 3 times, and I think now that I see it again, I'm going to start and read it another time. It's just a wild adventure. Now, this is a biography on Corbett, but he has his own book out. I think it was called The Man-Eaters of Kumaon. It's in India. And it is a riveting book, very well written. I cannot find my copy, but I found this version just to show you. We're going to put some links up. We'll find that book and we'll put some links on here so you can order those. Really some historical information that you would love to find out about. And that's my story on the 757. So until next time, I want to thank you all for listening. If you have any more information on the 757, especially some really interesting historical facts, send them in and we'll read them on our podcast version on YouTube podcasts. And until then, this is Ron Spomer signing off. Hunt honest and shoot straight.